Imagine winning 3 NBA championships. Imagine being called the most technically perfect post player in the history of professional basketball. Imagine having Larry Bird, one of the greatest players who ever lived, say that you were the most skilled big man he ever shared a court with. Imagine being inducted into the Hall of Fame, your name etched permanently into basketball history, your legacy secured for generations. Now imagine that none of that, not one single trophy, not one standing ovation, not one banner hanging in the rafters, was enough to fill the emptiness inside you. Imagine playing through a broken foot for an entire season because you refused to let your teammates down, and then watching your body pay for that decision every single day for the rest of your life. Imagine spending decades as the most important player nobody fully talked about, always standing inches from the spotlight, but never quite inside it. And then imagine that after all of that, after every sacrifice and every championship and every silent contribution that made other men legends, the greatest pain of your life had absolutely nothing to do with basketball. It came from a hospital room. It came from a disease that could not be defended against with footwork or post moves. It came from losing your daughter at 23 years old. This is the real story of Kevin McHale. And I promise you, it is nothing like what you think you already know. Kevin McHale grew up in Hibbing, Minnesota, a small town where winter arrived early and stayed long, where the landscape was flat and wide and quiet in a way that shaped the people who lived there. It was not a place of poverty or crisis. His family was stable and functional. But stability and emotional warmth are not always the same thing, and in the McHale household, important feelings tended to stay hidden rather than spoken. Words that could have built real connection between people were left unsaid. Conversations stayed on the surface. And a young Kevin absorbed that atmosphere so completely that it became part of who he was before he even had the language to understand what was happening to him. He was not the kid who drew attention in a room. He was not the one pulling the group toward him with a magnetic personality. He was the observer, the listener, the one who stood slightly outside the circle and watched how other people moved through the world. As if he was always taking notes on a life he was not quite sure how to join. In school he was present, but not prominent. He had no reputation for brilliance or troublemaking or social ease. He was simply there, quiet and watchful, in a way that adults probably found polite and peers probably found a little distant. Basketball changed the equation for him, but not in a dramatic, transformative moment. It was more subtle than that. It was the gym. The empty gym specifically, in the long afternoons when no one else was around, when the only sounds were the squeak of his shoes and the echo of the ball bouncing off the hardwood floor. In that space he did not have to perform for anyone. He did not have to fit in or find the right words or figure out the unspoken rules of how to belong. He just had to work. And working, it turned out, was the one thing he had always known how to do without needing any instruction from anyone. He repeated the same footwork patterns over and over. He practiced spinning away from imaginary defenders in the low post until the movements became automatic, until his body knew the geometry of those moves the way other people know the layout of their own house in the dark. He was not building a highlight reel. He was building precision. He was building an interior language that was entirely his own, one that required no words and no audience and no external validation to feel real. What he developed in those empty gyms was something that scouts and coaches would later struggle to fully articulate. It was not athleticism in the traditional sense. He was not going to overpower anyone with raw physical dominance or outrun anyone with explosive first steps. What he had was something rarer and more durable. He had perfect geometry. Every move he made near the basket was calculated, deliberate, connected to the next movement in a sequence that defenders could see coming and still could not stop. It was basketball as architecture. And he built it alone in silence, without anyone watching and without anyone telling him how. But even as his skill grew, he stayed invisible in the way that quiet people in small towns often do. He was talented enough to get noticed, to earn a scholarship, to move up through increasingly competitive levels of the game. But he was never the center of attention, and something about that arrangement felt familiar enough to be comfortable. He had been on the outside looking in for most of his life. The basketball version of that position was at least one where he was also getting better every day. When he entered the NBA draft in 1980 and was selected by the Boston Celtics, the basketball world had already sorted itself into a clear hierarchy, and Kevin McHale was not at the top of it. The Celtics already had Larry Bird. They already had Robert Parrish. They already had a system and an identity and a championship culture built around personalities bigger and louder than his. He was stepping into a locker room full of established stars, and nobody was going to clear a path for him or give him unlimited time to find his footing. He adapted the only way he knew how. He went to work. He accepted the role that was offered to him, which in those early years was the bench, coming off the reserve unit, being the player coaches called on when they needed steadiness rather than spectacle. He did not complain about the limited minutes. He did not lobby for a bigger role or remind anyone how much he was contributing in the time he was given. He simply made the most of whatever opportunity came his way, and he made it so efficiently that the basketball community gradually ran out of reasons to keep him in the background. He won the 6th Man of the Year award twice. 2 separate seasons where the entire league looked at every player who came off the bench and said this man is doing it better than everyone else. And he did it without turning it into a personal narrative. He did not campaign for recognition or remind reporters what his production numbers looked like in limited minutes. He just played, and the results were too obvious to ignore. But numbers were not the whole story, because in the Celtics system during those championship years, there were layers to what McHale contributed that statistics could not fully capture. He was the player other teams had to specifically prepare for. He was the one whose footwork forced opposing defensive coordinators to build entire game plans around stopping a particular set of moves near the paint. Opponents knew exactly what he was going to do and still could not stop him, which is the truest measure of mastery in any athletic discipline. When you can do something that your opponent is fully expecting and still cannot prevent, you have reached a level that goes beyond talent into something closer to art. The championships came. 3 of them, in 1981, 1984, and 1986. And in each of those title runs, McHale was a central piece of the machine that made it all work. He was not the one giving the memorable post-game quotes, or appearing on the magazine covers, or becoming the face of the dynasty in the way that Bird did. He was the one making the right play at the right moment, the one whose efficiency under pressure helped Boston stay level when other teams were falling apart. He was selected to the All-Star game 7 times. He made the all-defensive first team 3 times. His shooting percentage was the kind of number that made analysts look twice because it seemed too clean to be real. And yet he stood on the edge of the spotlight rather than inside it. Every championship celebration, every trophy presentation, every historic moment in that Celtics dynasty had McHale present but not centered. He was the supporting structure that held the building up, invisible in the way that good architecture is invisible until it fails. And it never failed. But nobody spends much time celebrating what never fails. They celebrate what dazzles, what announces itself loudly. McHale did not announce himself. He simply delivered, again and again, at a level that deserved far more acknowledgement than it received. There is something worth sitting within that pattern. He grew up in a home where recognition was not freely given. He developed his game in empty gyms where no applause was coming. He entered the NBA in a role that kept him one step removed from the main stage. Each of those experiences reinforced something already deep in his nature. The belief that you do your work, you do it well, and you do not expect the world to make a ceremony of it. That conviction made him extraordinarily reliable as a player. But it also meant that everything he carried stayed inside, never fully released, never fully processed, just stored. The physical cost of his career was significant and almost entirely hidden from the people watching. In the late 1980s, with the Celtics still competing at the highest level, McHale suffered a serious injury to his foot and ankle. The medical reality was clear. The damage was real. The sensible professional course of action was to stop, undergo proper treatment, and allow the body to fully heal before returning to competition. He chose none of that. He kept playing. He stepped onto the court game after game with an injury that was not just painful but structurally compromising. Every move, every defensive stance, every jump required his body to compensate for damage that was not healing because it was not being allowed to heal. He played without telling the audience. He played without turning it into a story. He played because in a culture built entirely around winning, stepping back felt like abandonment, and abandonment was not something his internal framework would allow. The long-term consequences were severe and entirely predictable. The damage accumulated. The structural problems that could have been addressed in one focused recovery period instead compounded over months of continued competition. By the time his body made it impossible to continue at the required level, the cost of those unhealed hours had already been paid in full, and would keep being paid in the years after retirement in the form of chronic pain that became a permanent feature of daily life. He retired in 1993, and the transition was harder than most people outside his immediate circle understood. The game had been his structure since his teenage years. It had given him purpose, schedule, and a clear measure of success. Without it, time became unfamiliar. The mornings without practice, the afternoons without film sessions, the evenings without the adrenaline of competition, they all expanded into a kind of openness that should have felt like freedom, but instead felt like a void. All the things that the noise and pressure of basketball had successfully covered for decades now had the chance to rise to the surface. And they did, quietly and persistently, the way suppressed things always eventually do. He moved into basketball operations, eventually taking a management role with the Minnesota Timberwolves. It was the logical next step for a man with his knowledge of the game. But management is a fundamentally different experience from playing. As a player, he could directly change outcomes with his body and his skill. As a manager, everything ran through other people, through decisions about contracts and roster construction and coaching philosophies, and the results of those decisions unfolded slowly over years rather than immediately within 4 quarters. The feedback loop was longer, the sense of personal agency was smaller, and the feeling of truly belonging to something was harder to hold onto. The seasons at Minnesota were difficult. Results were inconsistent. The media scrutinized every personnel decision. And McHale, who had spent his playing career deliberately staying out of the center of attention, now found that his decisions were the center of everyone's attention, and there was no way to manage that from the edge. He handled the pressure the way he had always handled difficulty. Without drama, without public complaint, without allowing the outside world to see the weight he was carrying. He showed up, made decisions, accepted the consequences, and kept moving. The opportunity to become head coach of the Houston Rockets felt like a different kind of chance. It put him back on the sideline, closer to the actual rhythm of games, closer to the competitive pulse that had defined most of his life. He approached the role with full preparation and seriousness. In stretches, the Rockets showed real improvement under his direction. There were winning runs, tactical displays that showed genuine basketball intelligence. But consistency remained just out of reach, and the NBA has limited patience for coaches whose teams cannot sustain their best level of play. The criticism intensified during losing periods. The questions became sharper. The patience from ownership shortened. And eventually, the way it almost always ends in professional sports, the decision was made to move in a different direction. He was let go. He left quietly, without public statements about being treated unfairly, without making the moment larger than it was. He simply gathered what he had learned and walked away. In silence, with everything kept inside. But all of that combined, the playing career, the championships, the injuries, the management years, the coaching tenure, was manageable compared to what came next. Because there are levels of difficulty in a human life, and somewhere above everything that professional sport can produce, there is the level that involves your children. Sasha McHale was diagnosed with lupus, an autoimmune disease that turns the body's own defenses against itself, attacking organs and tissue in a way that is unpredictable, exhausting, and deeply resistant to the kind of control that Kevin McHale had always relied on. Lupus does not follow the logic of sports seasons or preparation schedules. It moves on its own timeline. All you can do is be present, hope, adjust, and accept each new piece of information as it arrives. For a man who had built his entire identity around the ability to control outcomes through preparation and discipline and sheer will, watching his daughter fight something that his experience and reputation and willingness to work could not influence was a completely new kind of helplessness. There was no footwork pattern for this. There was no defensive scheme that could protect her. There was no championship experience to draw on. There was only a father in a hospital room watching his child be brave in circumstances that no parent should ever have to witness. Sasha died at 23 years old. She was young. She was his daughter. And the moment she was gone, every framework Kevin McHale had ever built for processing difficulty was revealed to be insufficient for this particular weight. He had endured a reserved childhood. He had endured years of being the most important supporting player on a championship team without receiving proportionate credit. He had endured playing through injury, managing through failure, coaching through the kind of scrutiny that breaks lesser people. But none of that had prepared him for permanent absence. None of it had given him tools for a void that had no recovery period on the other side of it. He did not collapse in public. He did not give tearful press conferences or dramatic statements about his grief. He returned to work within a relatively short period, resumed professional responsibilities, showed up to meetings and obligations the way his role required. From the outside, to people who did not know him well, he probably appeared to be handling it with the same stoic steadiness that had always defined him. But the people who had been in enough rooms with him over enough years all noticed something that no specific action or word made visible. Something in the quality of his presence had shifted permanently. The silences were heavier. The pauses between sentences carried more weight. The eyes that had always been watchful were now watching from a slightly greater distance, as if the world he was observing had moved further away. He kept working because work was one of the few things left that provided a structure for days that could otherwise become formless with grief. He kept showing up because that was the only language of endurance he had ever spoken fluently. But inside, the part of him that had always stored everything without releasing it was now storing something that could not be compressed. Something that refused to become manageable. Something that simply had to be lived with, carried forward, present in every quiet moment for the rest of his life. He gradually reduced his public presence in the years that followed. The appearances became less frequent. The high-profile roles became fewer. He moved toward a quieter existence, spending more time on his private life and his remaining family, protecting an interior space that had always been important to him but now felt essential in a way it never had before. He did not write books explaining his journey. He did not make television appearances to process his experience publicly. He held it close, the way he had always held everything close, in the interior space that was entirely his own and that no spotlight had ever fully reached. The memory of Sasha remained present not as a performance of grief, but as a permanent feature of his interior landscape. Something carried into every room, into every moment of quiet, into every game he watched or discussed or thought about. It was not something he talked about often, but it was something that everyone who spent real time with him understood was always there, shaping the particular quality of his silences. When people look back at Kevin McHale's career today, they tend to focus on what can be counted. 3 championships, 7 All-Star selections, 3 All-Defensive First-Team honors, Hall of Fame induction in 2009, a shooting efficiency that remains a reference point for how cleanly a big man can score. Every number is real. Every honor was earned through genuine mastery at the highest level of competition the sport produces. But the more complete story of Kevin McHale cannot be told in numbers. It has to be told in what the numbers do not show. The hours alone in empty gyms practicing moves no one was watching. The childhood in a household where feelings were stored rather than expressed. The championship years where his contribution was essential and his recognition was secondary. The foot he played on when he absolutely should not have been playing. The damage that grew quietly while the crowd applauded the victories that damage helped produce. The management and coaching years where he tried to find a new way to belong to the game that had always been his home and discovered the home felt different from the outside. And above all, the grief of a father who outlived his child and carried that weight with the same silence he had carried everything else, never asking the world to acknowledge how heavy it was. There is a kind of strength that American culture finds difficult to recognize because it does not perform itself. It does not announce itself with dramatic moments or emotional speeches or public displays that allow other people to witness and validate it. It is the strength of the person who simply keeps going, who does the work, absorbs the cost, accepts the loss, and continues to exist in the world without making the suffering the center of a narrative. Kevin McHale embodied that kind of strength for his entire adult life. It is both the most admirable thing about him and the thing that made his story hardest to fully see while it was happening. He was not a tragic figure in the traditional sense. He had championships. He had genuine greatness. He had a career that most basketball players would trade their own for without hesitation. But greatness and wholeness are not the same thing, and success and fulfillment do not always arrive together. He reached the top of his profession and found that the view from there did not fill the spaces inside him that had been empty since childhood. He built an extraordinary public legacy and carried a private weight that the trophies could not lighten. What he leaves behind is not just a record in a stat book or a banner in a building. It is an example of a particular way of being human. The way that demands you show up even when showing up costs more than anyone around you can see. The way that requires you to keep your commitments even when the body is compromised and the heart is heavy, and the only reward for doing so is the quiet knowledge that you did what was required. The way that does not ask for an audience for its suffering because it understands, perhaps more deeply than anything else, that some of the most real and most important things in a life happen in spaces where no one is watching. Kevin McHale spent his career in those spaces. In the empty gyms, in the locker rooms after the cameras left, in the hospital corridors where a father sat with his daughter and understood that nothing in his extraordinary life had prepared him for this particular moment. He lived with all of it. He kept moving through all of it. He never asked you to notice. That is the real story. And now that you know it, the championships mean something different. The Hall of Fame plaque means something different. The perfectly constructed post moves, the rings, the quiet excellence of a career lived mostly in someone else's spotlight, All of it means something different when you understand what it was built on and what it was carried alongside. Not just talent, not just hard work, but a kind of endurance that goes deeper than sport and touches something that every person who has ever had to keep going when keeping going felt impossible will immediately recognize. Kevin McHale kept going. For decades. Through everything. And that, more than any number or trophy or banner, is his real and lasting legacy.